So when you think of punk rock, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably safety pins, spitting, just absolutely screaming guitars, right? But what if I told you that this very same gritty, chaotic music genre actually became one of the most powerful, completely decentralized vehicles for feminist ideology in modern history? Well, welcome to today's Explainer. We are going to dive right in and unpack the incredibly fascinating intersection of punk rock and feminism, and really trace how an underground music scene morphed into this huge platform for radical social change.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. 1. Breaking the male framework. 2. The DIY feminist engine. 3. The Riot Grrrl revolution. And finally 4. Activism beyond the music. Let's get into it. Starting off with Section 1, Breaking the Male Framework.
To truly grasp the massive impact women had in punk, we first have to set the scene and look at the mainstream music landscape that punk completely crashed into during the mid-1970s. You see, the mainstream rock and heavy metal industry back then was just a massive boys' club. Women were largely treated as passive consumers, or honestly just mere sex objects. Sure, a woman singing might have been acceptable, but actually playing an instrument, that was heavily gay-kept. But then, boom, early punk culture hits. This was an anti-establishment movement that offered equal ground right from day one. Women weren't just standing in the crowd. They were active participants, lead singers, shedding on guitars, the whole shebang. Artists like Casey Hind actually noted that the beauty of the early punk scene was that the sexual discrimination you saw everywhere else just didn't really exist there.
I absolutely love how Sonic Youth's Kim Gordon captures the appeal of this era. She said, "I think women are natural anarchists because you're always operating in a male framework." It hits the nail right on the head. The very core of punk is inherently anti-authoritarian. It's all about rebelling against the rules and the status quo. And obviously, that was just a perfect, completely natural fit for the female experience of navigating and rebelling against a patriarchal society.
But we have to remember, this wasn't just about internal feelings. There were massive socio-political shifts driving this whole movement too. For instance, over in the UK, you had the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975, which legally allowed women the same access to jobs as men. Awesome, right? Well, it actually caused a pretty significant backlash from some men who suddenly felt their traditional roles were being threatened. So you combine that social tension with massive political shifts, like the eventual election of Margaret Thatcher, and you had an entire generation of young women feeling deeply disenfranchised. And where did they go? They ran straight into the aggressive, expressive, and totally welcoming arms of the early punk scene. Which brings us to Section 2, the DIY feminist engine.
So, we know exactly why women joined punk, but how did they actually get their voices heard? Because major corporate record labels certainly weren't going to sign them. The answer? Do it yourself. DIY. The actual mechanical, operational side of punk is what allowed these feminist ideologies to thrive entirely without asking for corporate permission. Think about it as a three-step process. First, since music magazines totally ignored them, they just created their own homemade underground publications, zines. Second, they self-released their own music, literally bypassing traditional industry gatekeepers entirely. And third, these bands organized self-funded tours, booking their own shows and handling every piece of logistics themselves. This completely self-reliant methodology meant that marginalized voices simply couldn't be silenced anymore.
Now, a really vital takeaway here is the concept of ideology over aesthetics. Because when a lot of people picture a punk woman, they immediately think of the fashion, right? The fishnet stockings, safety pins, the wild spiky hair. But for the women who are actually living and breathing the scene, it was far less about those stereotypical aesthetics. The clothing was really just a middle finger to the commodified fashion industry. The true beating heart of the movement was about grassroots organization, community building, self-actualization, and hardcore political resistance.
Let's jump into Section 3, the Riot Grrrl revolution. Fast forward with me to the early 1990s, over to Olympia, Washington, and the greater Pacific Northwest. This is where punk feminism really crystallized into a highly organized, very specific subculture that we know as Riot Grrrl. This movement explicitly mashed up feminism, punk music, and politics, and it's super closely associated with third-wave feminism. Basically, these young women took that DIY ethos from the 70s and completely weaponized it to build an underground space explicitly designed for female empowerment.
And they made their mission incredibly clear right from the start. Take the band Bikini Kill, for example. They would actively hand out these pamphlets at their 1993 gigs that literally said, "I want her to know that she is included in this show, that what we are doing is for her to criticize, laugh at, be inspired by." It just perfectly illustrates how Riot Grrrl acts weren't just up there playing songs. No, they were actively turning their concerts into these inclusive places of debate, agency, and most importantly, safety for young women. In fact, they famously started a tradition of telling the men to move to the back of the venue just so women could finally, safely, occupy the front rows.
And these bands were not holding back, okay? They weren't singing about trivial things. They were tackling the patriarchy, domestic abuse, sexual assault, racism, classism, just taking it all head-on. Their music functioned as a direct, completely unfiltered vehicle for radical socio-political awareness. They were demanding that society look squarely at the harsh, ugly realities that women and minorities were waking up to every single day.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 4, Activism Beyond the Music.
So, how did this immense momentum of punk feminism inevitably spill off the stage and into direct societal transformation? Well, because punk was so inherently non-normative, it naturally provided a safe haven, real solidarity, and a megaphone for unaccepted individuals. And it wasn't just about feminism either. This same environment fostered queercore bands and LGBTQIA+ liberation. The shared discomfort of feeling like a total outcast in mainstream society actually bred incredible solidarity within the punk scene. It allowed beautifully diverse groups of people to unite over their shared struggles.
And that deep solidarity, it translated straight into action. The punk ethos literally demanded individual critical thinking. Like one band put it, institutions will never set you free. Ask questions, take responsibility. This readiness to actually talk about social problems turned into real boots-on-the-ground grassroots activism. Riot Grrrls formed chapters all across the country. They held town hall-style meetings, and they even organized self-defense workshops to explicitly spread awareness about sexual assault. They didn't just sing about a broken world. They actively rolled up their sleeves to change it.
Let's trace this timeline real quick, because this framework has an enduring, truly global impact. We start with the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act, fueling early punk feminism in the UK. Then we jump to the 90s, where Riot Grrrl formalized feminist punk in Washington. And then look all the way to 2012, where the Russian collective Pussy Riot used these exact same punk principles to oppose government dictates and advocate for LGBT rights on a massive global stage. The framework that was literally built in dingy basements in the 70s is still being actively used to challenge world leaders today.
So what is the ultimate takeaway for us here? It's that true cultural impact does not require a massive budget, and it definitely doesn't require major corporate backing. Authenticity triumphs over millions, every single time. The women of punk prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that with creativity, community, a DIY spirit, and a fierce, unapologetic commitment to your truth, you can build an infrastructure of underground media and music that literally shifts the culture.
Which leaves us with a final, slightly provocative thought to wrap up our explainer today. How can the DIY feminist ethos of punk be applied to create meaningful change in today's highly commercialized, super digital world? Think about it. If zines and self-funded tours successfully bypass the giant gatekeepers of the 70s and 90s, what is the equivalent tool for you to take back your power today? It's something to chew on. Thank you so much for learning with us today, and as always, keep asking questions.